I became obsessed with identifying paint chemical signatures. It ended up exposing the art forger who framed my mother. I spent 6 years learning to identify paint formulations by their chemical composition, and nobody understood why a 27-year-old woman would waste her time analyzing pigments under a microscope instead of doing something practical with her chemistry degree. My name is Victoria Hayes, and I'd been working as a lab technician at a pharmaceutical company since graduating from UC Berkeley, but every evening and weekend I'd be in my apartment dissecting paint samples, running gas chromatography tests, and building databases of chemical signatures from different manufacturers and time periods. It started when I took an elective course on art conservation during my senior year and became fascinated by how you could date paintings through pigment analysis, how titanium white wasn't commercially available until 1921, how certain cadmium formulations could pinpoint a decade, how trace elements in lapis lazuli could identify the specific mine where the stone was ground into ultramarine blue. My professor thought I had potential for conservation work, but I didn't want to restore paintings. I wanted to understand them at the molecular level, to read their chemical stories the way other people read brushstrokes or composition. My boyfriend left me after 8 months because I'd rather spend Friday nights running spectroscopy tests than going to bars, and my mother kept suggesting gently that maybe I should focus on advancing my actual career instead of this expensive hobby that was taking over my tiny apartment with equipment I'd bought on credit. My father had died when I was 16, and my mother Elena had supported us through her work as a mid-level commercial artist, doing magazine illustrations and corporate commissions that paid bills but never quite fulfilled her artistic ambitions. She'd wanted to be a fine artist, had studied painting in Prague before immigrating to the States, but life and practical necessities had redirected her path. And I think she saw my obsession with paint chemistry as another example of chasing impractical passions instead of building stable foundations. The irony was that my mother understood artistic obsession better than anyone, even if she'd channeled hers into commercial work. She'd always encouraged my interest in science, had paid for my college education by working 60-hour weeks, and had never once suggested I should pursue something more traditionally feminine or less challenging. But this paint analysis hobby seemed different to her, seemed too niche and disconnected from marketable skills, and our weekly dinners had developed this uncomfortable pattern where she'd ask about my job, and I'd give minimal answers before redirecting to whatever paint mystery I was currently investigating. The last normal conversation we'd had before everything fell apart was 3 weeks ago in November, when she'd shown me some new illustration work for a tech company's annual report, and I'd barely looked at it because I was excited about identifying a rare cobalt violet formulation in a sample from a supposedly 19th century landscape. She'd asked me directly whether I was happy, whether this obsession was fulfilling some need that I wasn't addressing in healthier ways, and I'd gotten defensive and said that just because she'd given up on her artistic dreams didn't mean I had to give up on understanding art at a deeper level. She'd looked hurt, and we'd finished dinner in awkward silence, and I'd left her house feeling guilty, but also frustrated that nobody seemed to understand why chemical signatures mattered. 3 weeks later, at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, I got a phone call from my mother and immediately knew something catastrophic had happened from the way she was crying so hard she could barely speak. She managed to say that the FBI had raided her studio that afternoon, that they'd seized her paintings and her computers and her materials, and that she'd been formally accused of creating forged artworks that had been sold through several galleries for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The next morning, I drove to her house in Oakland and found her sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. The FBI's evidence seemed overwhelming and terrifyingly comprehensive. They had 3 paintings that had been sold as works by minor impressionist artists from the 1880s and 1890s, paintings that had been authenticated by reputable experts and had sold for between $200,000 and $400,000 each over the past 2 years. Chemical analysis by the FBI's lab had revealed that the paintings contained synthetic pigments that hadn't existed in the 19th century, specifically titanium white in a formulation that dated to the 1980s at the earliest, and phthalocyanine blue, which hadn't been invented until 1907. Even worse, they'd found partially completed canvases in my mother's studio that matched the painting style of the forgeries, along with research materials about the artists whose work had supposedly been forged, and receipts for materials that could have been used to create artificially aged paintings. My mother swore she hadn't created any forgeries, that she had no idea where those partial paintings had come from, that someone must have planted evidence in her studio. But even as she said it, I could see the defeat in her eyes, the knowledge that no jury would believe her story when the physical evidence was so damning. Her lawyer, a public defender named Rachel Kim, who looked exhausted before the meeting even started, explained that the prosecution had a strong case, that art forgery carried serious federal penalties, and that my mother should consider pleading guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence of maybe 5 to 7 years instead of risking 20 years at trial. I watched my mother's hands shake as she held her coffee mug and felt this crushing rage at the injustice of it, at how everything she'd worked for was being destroyed by accusations she insisted were false. I asked Rachel if I could see the FBI's lab reports, and she looked at me with suspicion before asking why I thought I was qualified to review federal forensic evidence. I explained my background in chemistry and my 6 years of studying paint formulations, and I saw her expression shift from skepticism to something like desperate hope, the look of someone drowning who's just been thrown a rope. She said she'd request copies of the technical reports but warned me not to expect anything useful, that the FBI lab was extremely thorough, and if they'd identified anachronistic pigments, then those pigments were definitely there. My mother was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and concern, and she asked quietly whether I really thought I could find something that federal experts had missed. I told her honestly that I didn't know, but that I had to try, that I'd spent 6 years developing expertise in exactly this kind of analysis, and if I couldn't use it to help her, then what had been the point of any of it? Over the next week, I got copies of the FBI reports and began the most intensive analysis I'd ever attempted, cross-referencing their findings against my own databases of paint formulations and looking for anything inconsistent or unusual in the chemical signatures they'd documented. The FBI had done solid work in identifying the anachronistic pigments, but their analysis had stopped there, focused only on proving the paintings weren't genuinely 19th century, rather than investigating who might have created them. What interested me were the specific formulations they'd found, the exact ratios of titanium dioxide to zinc oxide in the white paint, the particular stabilizers and extenders mixed with the pigment base, the trace elements that could identify which manufacturer had produced the paint and approximately when. I spent 18-hour days running my own tests on paint samples that Rachel managed to get released for independent analysis, comparing the chemical signatures against every major paint manufacturer's formulations from 1980 onward. The titanium white that had been used contained a specific combination of aluminum stearate as a stabilizer and silica as an extender that narrowed the possible manufacturers to 3 companies, and cross-referencing with the phthalocyanine blue formulation narrowed it further to a single manufacturer called Chromex Industrial Coatings, which had produced artist-grade paints under the brand name Artisan's Choice from 1983 to 2006. What made this significant was that my mother had never used Artisan's Choice paints in her entire career. I went through every tube and jar in her studio, checked purchase records going back 15 years, and found that she exclusively used either Winsor & Newton or Gamblin paints, both of which had distinctly different chemical signatures from the Artisan's Choice formulations in the forged paintings. I brought this information to Rachel, who seemed genuinely excited for the first time since taking the case, and she immediately filed a motion arguing that the paint evidence proved my mother couldn't have created the forgeries. The prosecutor's response came back within 3 days, dismissing our findings as irrelevant because obviously a sophisticated forger would use different paints for forgeries than for their regular work, and the judge agreed, denying our motion and keeping the trial date set for January. I felt sick reading the prosecutor's argument because it was logically sound, even though it ignored the fundamental question of why my mother would have Artisan's Choice paintings in progress in her studio when she'd never purchased or used Artisan's Choice paints in her life. That discrepancy kept nagging at me because it suggested someone had deliberately planted those partial paintings, which meant someone had access to my mother's studio and a reason to frame her. I started making lists of everyone who'd been in her studio over the past year, cross-referencing with people who might have art forgery skills and knowledge of paint chemistry. My mother's studio was in a shared warehouse space in West Oakland where about 20 artists rented individual units, and while she kept her unit locked, the building manager had master keys and several artists had borrowed her space when she was traveling. The most frequent borrower was a painter named Gregory Thorne who rented the unit next to hers, and who'd been friendly with my mother for about 5 years, often asking her advice about materials and techniques. When I asked my mother about Gregory, she described him as talented but struggling, someone who'd never quite achieved gallery representation despite years of effort, and who'd recently been complaining about money troubles and the unfairness of the art market favoring mediocre work with good connections over genuine talent without access. Something about that description triggered my professional instincts, and I asked if Gregory had ever shown interest in old master techniques or historical painting methods. My mother thought for a moment and then said yes. Actually, Gregory had been obsessed with 19th century painting methods for the past 2 years, had purchased antique canvases and period-appropriate frames, had asked her detailed questions about aging techniques and patina development, all supposedly for a series of paintings exploring historical authenticity in contemporary art. I felt my heart rate accelerate because that level of interest in historical methods combined with financial desperation and studio access created exactly the profile of someone who might create forgeries. I asked Rachel if we could investigate Gregory Thorne, but she said we had no probable cause and no resources for independent investigation, that criminal defense was about creating reasonable doubt, not proving alternate theories, and the judge had already indicated skepticism about our paint analysis. So I decided to investigate on my own, starting with Gregory's background and trying to find any connection to the galleries where the forged paintings had been sold. His website showed competent but unremarkable landscape paintings in a vaguely impressionist style, and his biography mentioned studying at the San Francisco Art Institute and doing a residency in France, but there was nothing obviously suspicious. I spent 3 days researching his exhibition history and finally found something interesting buried in a gallery newsletter from 2 years ago. Gregory had been represented by the Ashford Gallery in San Francisco for a brief period in early 2021, right around the time the first forged painting had appeared on the market, and the gallery's owner was a man named Charles Ashford, who specialized in 19th-century American and European paintings. The Ashford Gallery had sold 2 of the 3 forged paintings that my mother was accused of creating, and Gregory had been dropped from their roster after only 6 months, right around the time the first questions about authenticity had started emerging. I brought this information to Rachel, and she agreed it was suspicious, but still not enough for the judge to allow us to officially investigate Gregory, that we'd need something more concrete linking him to the forgeries. I realized I needed to get samples of Gregory's paint and compare them to the forgeries, which meant I needed access to his studio, and the only way to get that access was to go there myself without permission and take samples that wouldn't be legally admissible, but might point me toward admissible evidence. Breaking into Gregory's studio was easier than I'd expected, because the warehouse building had minimal security, and I knew from my mother where the building manager kept the spare keys. I waited until 2 a.m. on a Wednesday night when I knew Gregory would be at his restaurant job, picked the lock on the manager's office, borrowed the master key long enough to make an impression in modeling clay, and returned it before driving to a 24-hour locksmith who made me a copy without asking questions. The whole process felt surreal and terrifying, and I kept thinking about how many laws I was breaking and how if I got caught it would destroy any credibility I had and probably make my mother's case worse. But I couldn't see any other option because the legal system had already decided my mother was guilty and wasn't interested in alternative theories. Gregory's studio was cluttered with paintings in various stages of completion, and I immediately noticed several canvases that looked much older than his recent work, with yellowed varnish and surface craquelure that suggested age. I took photos of everything and then started collecting paint samples, scraping tiny amounts from the edges of palettes and the rims of paint tubes, storing each sample in labeled vials that I'd brought in my backpack. The Artisan's Choice brand tubes were right there in his supply cabinet, dozens of them, and I felt a rush of vindication seeing them even though I knew this evidence had been obtained illegally and couldn't be used in court. I also found something else that made my blood run cold, a folder containing detailed research on my mother's painting style, her signature, her exhibition history, and handwritten notes about her studio security and schedule. The notes made it clear that Gregory had been planning to frame my mother for months, had studied her work carefully enough to create forgeries that would be attributed to her if they were ever questioned. There were sketches showing how to replicate her brushwork, color mixing formulas matching her palette, and a timeline indicating he'd started creating the forgeries in late 2020 after being dropped by the Ashford Gallery. The final page had a chilling note that read, "Elena trusts me, gives studio access freely, will never suspect until too late." I photographed every page with shaking hands and then carefully returned everything to its exact position, trying not to leave any trace that I'd been there. When I got home at 4 a.m., I immediately started running chemical analysis on the paint samples I'd taken, comparing them against the FBI's reports on the forgeries. The match was perfect and damning. The titanium white formulation from Gregory's Artisan's Choice tubes had the exact same aluminum stearate and silica signature as the white paint in the forgeries, and the phthalocyanine blue was identical down to the trace element ratios. I had proof that Gregory had created the forgeries, but I'd obtained that proof through illegal means that would be thrown out of court and could potentially get me arrested. Rachel's response when I told her what I'd done was a mix of horror and grudging respect, and she made me promise never to do anything that stupid again before explaining that we couldn't use illegally obtained evidence, but we could use the information to direct legal investigators toward the same findings. She filed a motion requesting that the FBI investigate Gregory Thorne based on his connection to the Ashford Gallery and his access to my mother's studio, but the prosecutor objected strenuously, and the judge denied the motion, stating that the defense was engaged in desperate speculation rather than presenting relevant evidence. I felt crushed by the judge's ruling because I'd risked everything to get that evidence and it wasn't going to matter. My mother was still going to trial in 6 weeks with a case she couldn't win, and Gregory was going to get away with destroying her life. My mother had started talking about accepting the plea deal, saying that 5 years was better than 20, and at least she'd still have some life left when she got out, and I couldn't stand watching her give up when I knew she was innocent. I started thinking about other ways to expose Gregory, legal ways that wouldn't compromise the case, and I realized that the key was Charles Ashford. If Gregory had created forgeries specifically to sell through the Ashford Gallery, then Ashford either knew about the forgeries and was complicit, or had been deceived by Gregory and might cooperate if he understood the situation. I made an appointment to visit the gallery under the pretense of being interested in 19th century landscapes, and Charles Ashford turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. A smooth, cultured man in his 60s who spoke about art with the kind of superficial expertise that impresses laypeople but reveals itself as shallow under any serious questioning. I asked him about his authentication process, and he gave me a rehearsed speech about working with respected experts and using scientific analysis when appropriate, and I mentioned casually that I'd heard he'd had some authentication issues recently with paintings that turned out to contain anachronistic materials. His expression shifted immediately to something guarded and slightly hostile, and he said that those issues had been resolved, and the responsible party had been identified and was facing justice. I asked if he was satisfied that the FBI had caught the right person, and he said absolutely, that Elena Hayes had clearly created the forgeries and the evidence was overwhelming. I let the conversation drift to other topics and then mentioned that I was a paint chemist and was curious about the specific formulations that had been used in the forgeries, whether the forger had tried to use period-appropriate materials or had been careless. Ashford seemed to relax slightly, apparently deciding I was just an enthusiastic amateur, and he said that actually the forger had been quite sophisticated in most respects, but had made the fatal error of using modern titanium white instead of lead white, which any serious forger would know was inappropriate for 19th century work. I nodded and said that was fascinating, and then asked whether he knew if the forger had used Artisan's Choice paint specifically, because that brand had a very distinctive chemical signature that I'd studied extensively. Ashford's face went completely blank for a moment, and then he asked why I was asking such specific questions. I told him the truth, that Elena Hayes was my mother, that I believed she'd been framed, and that I had evidence suggesting the real forger was Gregory Thorne, who'd been represented by this gallery and had access to the materials and knowledge necessary to create the forgeries. Ashford stood up abruptly and told me to leave, that he wouldn't be manipulated by desperate family members making wild accusations, and that if I contacted him again, he'd call the police. His reaction told me everything I needed to know about whether he was complicit or deceived. He was complicit. He'd known about the forgeries, had probably encouraged Gregory to create them, and when authentication questions arose, he'd needed someone to take the blame, and my mother had been the perfect target because of her proximity to Gregory and her commercial art background that made her seem like a plausible forger. I went directly from the gallery to Rachel's office and told her about my conversation with Ashford, and she listened with increasing interest before asking if I thought Ashford would cooperate if he faced criminal charges himself. I said I thought he'd flip on Gregory instantly if it meant reducing his own liability, that his reaction suggested he was terrified of being exposed and would protect himself over anyone else. Rachel said she'd talked to the prosecutor about investigating Ashford's role, but she warned me not to expect much because the prosecutor was focused on convicting my mother and wouldn't want to complicate a strong case by introducing alternate theories. The prosecutor's response came back 3 days later. They'd investigated Charles Ashford's background and found no evidence of criminal conduct, and my conversation with him had been inappropriate contact with a witness that could potentially compromise the case. I felt rage building in my chest at how thoroughly the system was failing my mother, at how every attempt to present the truth was being blocked by legal procedures and prosecutorial tunnel vision. My mother's trial was now 3 weeks away, and Rachel was preparing for a defense that basically amounted to claiming the FBI had made mistakes in their analysis, which wasn't true and wouldn't convince a jury. I spent a weekend going through every piece of evidence again, every chemical analysis and every timeline, trying to find something I'd missed that could break the case open. What I kept coming back to was the question of how Gregory had gotten the forged paintings authenticated in the first place, because reputable authentication experts don't usually make mistakes about paintings containing obviously modern materials. I started researching the authentication expert who'd certified the first forged painting, a man named Dr. Lawrence Pemberton, who had a PhD in art history and ran a consulting firm specializing in 19th century European paintings. His credentials were impeccable and his reputation was spotless, which made it even stranger that he'd authenticated a painting containing titanium white and phthalocyanine blue without noticing the anachronistic materials. I read through every available interview and publication by Pemberton, looking for any mention of his authentication methodology, and found that he'd written extensively about the importance of combining connoisseurship with scientific analysis to verify attributions. He specifically emphasized the use of pigment analysis and X-ray fluorescence to detect modern materials, which meant he should have caught the anachronistic pigments immediately, unless he hadn't actually performed the scientific analysis he claimed to have done, or unless he'd deliberately overlooked the results because he was being paid to authenticate forgeries. I found Pemberton's office number and called, reaching an assistant who informed me that Dr. Pemberton was traveling in Europe and wouldn't be available for consultation for another month. I left a message saying I was researching authentication methodologies for paintings from the 1880s and would appreciate discussing his approach, and I got a call back within 2 hours from Pemberton himself, who said he'd heard about my mother's case and was deeply disturbed by the suggestion that he'd authenticated forgeries. His voice had an edge of defensiveness that made me suspicious, and I asked him directly whether he'd performed pigment analysis on the paintings he'd authenticated. There was a long pause before he said that he'd relied on visual examination and provenance research, that the paintings had come from a reputable source through the Ashford Gallery, and had appeared entirely consistent with the attributed artist's known work. I asked whether it was standard practice to authenticate paintings without scientific analysis, and Pemberton said stiffly that scientific analysis wasn't always necessary when provenance and visual evidence were strong, and that budget constraints sometimes limited the extent of testing. I pressed further and asked whether Charles Ashford had influenced his decision not to perform pigment analysis, and Pemberton's tone shifted to something more hostile, saying that he resented the implication that he'd been unprofessional or negligent in his work, and that my mother was guilty regardless of whether his authentication process had been perfect. I thanked him for his time and hung up, feeling certain that Ashford had pressured Pemberton to skip the scientific analysis that would have revealed the modern pigments, and that Pemberton was now trying to protect his reputation by maintaining that the paintings had appeared genuine. Rachel listened to my account of the conversation and said we could try to get Pemberton to testify about his authentication process, but that it wouldn't change the fundamental evidence that the forgeries had been found in my mother's studio. I felt trapped by the circularity of the logic. The forgeries proved my mother was guilty, and any evidence suggesting someone else created them was dismissed because the forgeries were in her studio. The only way to break that circle was to prove definitively that Gregory had both created the forgeries and planted them in my mother's studio, and the only way to prove that was through evidence that would be admissible in court. I spent the next week developing a plan that was risky and possibly illegal, but was the only option I could see for getting the evidence we needed. I would provoke Gregory into revealing his involvement by confronting him directly about the forgeries, wearing a wire provided by Rachel's investigator, and trying to get him to make incriminating statements. Rachel was against the plan immediately, saying it was dangerous and unlikely to work because Gregory would just deny everything. But I argued that we had nothing to lose because my mother was going to be convicted anyway, unless we did something drastic. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Chen, said he'd help me get wired but warned me not to provoke Gregory into violence, that if I felt threatened at any point, I should leave immediately. I wore the wire to Gregory's studio on a Thursday evening when I knew he'd be there working, and I knocked on his door with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might be audible. Gregory answered looking surprised and slightly wary, and I told him I needed to talk to him about my mother's case. He invited me in with studied casualness, offering me coffee and asking how Elena was holding up, and I felt nauseous at his performance of concern. I waited until we were sitting before I said I knew he'd created the forgeries that my mother was being blamed for, that I'd analyzed the paint signatures and they matched his materials exactly, and that I had evidence proving he'd framed her. Gregory's expression didn't change for several seconds, and then he smiled slightly and said that was quite an accusation to make without proof. I told him I had proof, that I'd taken paint samples from his studio and they matched the forgeries perfectly, and that I also had photos of his research notes about my mother's painting style and studio schedule. His smile disappeared and he stood up abruptly, asking how I'd gotten into his studio, and I told him that didn't matter because the evidence existed regardless. He said that any evidence I'd obtained illegally would be thrown out of court, and besides, even if he had created similar paintings, there was no proof he'd planted anything in Elena's studio. I asked him directly why he'd done it, why he'd destroyed an innocent person's life just for money and revenge against a gallery that had dropped him. Gregory's face twisted into something ugly, and he said that Elena had everything handed to her, steady income and respect and opportunities, while he'd spent 20 years creating genuine art and getting nothing but rejection and poverty, that the art world was corrupt and favored mediocrity over talent, and that if he was going to be poor anyway, he might as well make money from it. He said that creating the forgeries had been easy, that he'd studied 19th century techniques extensively, and the only challenge had been aging the paintings convincingly, and that framing Elena had been necessary because the FBI was getting too close to the truth and he needed someone to take the blame. I felt cold listening to him confess so casually, as if destroying someone's life was just a practical business decision, and I asked if he felt any guilt at all about what he'd done to my mother. Gregory shrugged and said that Elena would be fine eventually, that 5 years in prison wasn't that long, and that she should have been more careful about who she trusted with her studio access. His complete lack of remorse made me furious, and I said that he was pathetic and cowardly, that instead of improving his own work, he'd stolen others' reputations and destroyed an innocent person, and that I'd make sure everyone knew the truth even if it took the rest of my life. Gregory's expression shifted to something dangerous, and he said that actually I wouldn't tell anyone anything because I'd broken into his studio and stolen his materials, and that made me a criminal too. And if I went to the police with my illegally obtained evidence, he'd press charges for burglary and theft and destruction of property. I realized I'd miscalculated badly because Gregory wasn't going to confess on tape. He was going to threaten me instead, and nothing he'd said so far was specific enough to be truly incriminating. I tried a different approach and asked whether Charles Ashford had been involved in the plan, whether he'd known about the forgeries from the beginning or had figured it out later. Gregory hesitated and then said that Ashford had approached him with the idea, had seen his historical technique work and realized they could create forgeries together and split the profits, and that Ashford had handled the authentication and sales while Gregory created the paintings. He said that when questions started arising about the first forgery, Ashford had panicked and suggested they needed to frame someone, and Gregory had proposed Elena because of their proximity and because her commercial background would make the forgery accusation believable. He described the whole process clinically, explaining how he'd carefully researched my mother's materials and methods, how he'd planted the partial paintings in her studio during a weekend when she was visiting family, how he'd made sure the FBI would find everything they needed to build a case. I asked if Ashford was still paying him, or if he'd been cut loose after my mother was arrested, and Gregory said bitterly that Ashford had stopped paying him the moment the FBI got involved, had basically told him to disappear, and had kept all the profits from the forgery sales. The bitterness in his voice was what finally gave me leverage, and I said that it seemed unfair that Ashford was going to walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars while Gregory faced potential exposure, and that maybe Gregory should consider cooperating with authorities to make sure Ashford didn't escape justice. Gregory laughed and said he wasn't stupid enough to confess to federal crimes just to hurt Ashford, that he'd keep his mouth shut and let Elena take the fall, and eventually this would all blow over. I left Gregory's studio feeling defeated, because while I'd gotten a full confession on tape, he'd also been right that the recording had been obtained through deceptive means and might not be admissible in court, and he'd made enough threats that using it could expose me to criminal charges. I met with Rachel and Marcus and played them the recording, and Rachel's face went through a series of expressions as she listened, ending on something between triumph and despair. She said the confession was damning and detailed, but that using it in court was legally problematic because I'd recorded someone without their consent in a state that required two-party consent for recordings, which made the tape potentially inadmissible. Marcus suggested we take the tape to the FBI and let them decide how to handle it, that even if it couldn't be used in court, it might convince them to investigate Gregory and Ashford more thoroughly. Rachel made the call, and we ended up in a meeting with the FBI agents who'd investigated my mother's case, along with an assistant U.S. attorney who listened to the recording with an expression of growing anger. The AUSA said the recording was problematic from an evidentiary standpoint, but that it provided sufficient probable cause to get warrants for Gregory's studio and Charles Ashford's business records, and that if they could corroborate the confession with physical evidence, then they could build a case that didn't rely on the inadmissible recording. Within 48 hours, the FBI had executed search warrants on both Gregory's studio and the Ashford Gallery, seizing materials and records and computers. They found exactly what I'd found in Gregory's studio: artisan's choice paints matching the forgeries, research materials on my mother's painting style, and additional partially completed forgeries hidden in a storage space Gregory had rented under a false name. The evidence from the Ashford Gallery was even more damning because it included financial records showing payments from Ashford to Gregory totaling over $150,000 over 2 years, along with emails discussing authentication strategies and buyer contacts that made it clear both men had been fully aware they were selling forgeries. Dr. Lawrence Pemberton was also implicated through emails showing that Ashford had explicitly told him not to perform pigment analysis on the paintings because the clients are expecting quick turnaround and scientific testing would delay the sales. The prosecutor dropped all charges against my mother 3 days before her trial was scheduled to begin, and simultaneously filed charges against Gregory Thorne and Charles Ashford for conspiracy to commit fraud, creation of forged artwork, and obstruction of justice. Gregory was arrested without bail because the judge considered him a flight risk, and Ashford was released on $500,000 bond after turning over his passport. My mother's reaction when Rachel called with the news was initially disbelief, then overwhelming relief, then anger at how close she'd come to being convicted for crimes she didn't commit. I went to her house that evening and found her crying in her studio, surrounded by the paintings the FBI had finally returned, and she hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe and said that I'd saved her life through my obsessive weird hobby that everyone had thought was pointless. I told her that I was sorry I'd said she'd given up on her artistic dreams, that I understood now why she'd chosen stability over uncertainty, and that I was grateful she'd supported my education even when my interests seemed impractical. She said that watching me use my knowledge to fight for truth had reminded her why she'd loved art in the first place, that art was supposed to be about authentic expression and technical mastery, not about commercial success or institutional validation. The trial of Gregory Thorne and Charles Ashford lasted 3 weeks, and I attended every day, watching as prosecutors presented the evidence that had been built from my initial discoveries. The chemical analysis of Gregory's paints was central to the case, with expert witnesses explaining how the specific formulations matched the forgeries exactly, and how this was too precise to be coincidental. Gregory's defense attorney tried to argue that anyone could have purchased Artisan's choice paints, and that the presence of those paints in his studio didn't prove he'd created the forgeries. But that argument collapsed when prosecutors introduced the research materials and emails and financial records showing the full scope of the conspiracy. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played the recording I'd made in Gregory's studio, and while the defense objected strenuously and the judge ruled it inadmissible as evidence, he allowed it to be played for context in explaining how investigators had developed probable cause for the search warrants. Hearing Gregory's voice on that tape describing how he'd framed my mother made me feel sick all over again, and I saw several jurors' expressions harden with disgust as they listened to him explain his reasoning. Charles Ashford testified against Gregory in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming every detail of the conspiracy and providing additional information about how they'd planned to create and sell more forgeries before the FBI investigation had forced them to frame someone. His testimony destroyed any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for Gregory, painting him as not just a forger, but as someone who'd been willing to destroy an innocent person's life to protect his scheme. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Gregory Thorne, and he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of early release. Charles Ashford received 5 years plus restitution to the buyers who'd purchased the forged paintings, and Dr. Lawrence Pemberton lost his professional certifications and faced civil lawsuits from collectors who'd relied on his authentication services. The media coverage of the case focused heavily on how I'd used paint chemistry knowledge to exonerate my mother, with several articles calling it a triumph of specialized expertise over institutional failure. I did a few interviews explaining the technical aspects of pigment analysis and how chemical signatures can identify specific paint manufacturers and time periods, and I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for the importance of supporting seemingly impractical scientific research. Several art museums and conservation organizations reached out asking if I'd be interested in consulting on authentication questions, and I started doing that work part-time while keeping my pharmaceutical job for financial stability. My relationship with my mother transformed completely after the case ended, with both of us having a deeper appreciation for each other's choices and talents, and she started painting again for the first time in years, creating work that reflected her own vision rather than commercial demands. She sold a series of paintings through a small gallery in Berkeley, and the reviews praised her technical mastery and emotional depth, and watching her succeed on her own terms felt like completing a circle that had been broken by Gregory's betrayal. I still spend my evenings analyzing paint samples and building databases of chemical signatures, but now it feels less like an obsession and more like a calling, knowing that this knowledge has practical applications in protecting artists and collectors from fraud. The attention from the case has been overwhelming at times, with people treating me as some kind of forensic hero when really I was just using skills I'd developed for personal interest. But I'm learning to accept that sometimes obsessive hobbies do turn out to matter in unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.